and we're very excited to be here. And thank you to everybody for joining. I believe we have some slides to share that should be coming up any second. But just to give a quick intro of myself, my name is Phoebe Ewen, and I am the Programme Director at Mekong Club. I'm joined here today by my colleagues at United Nations University Institute in Macau, Sophie and Hannah, who I will pass over to soon. And today we're talking about a prize audit. So a prize audit is a smartphone app that's been designed in a collaboration between our two organisations to facilitate better worker interviews during social audits. So to identify potential cases of exploitation, for example, in factories within the supply chains. I'm getting a little bit of feedback. I hope my audio is okay. So if we can move to the next slide, please, Sophie, thank you. So as I mentioned, this project is a collaboration between us at Mekong Club and United Nations University Institute in Macau. This has been a really awesome collaboration because it brings together the research arm of UNU Macau and the kind of business connections and the NGO side of the Mekong Club to build a tool that's really fully operational now. It's being used by multinational companies in over 8 countries across Asia Pacific today. And we're looking to grow this out even further over the coming year. So I'll just give a very brief introduction to my organisation, Mekong Club. We exist to act as a catalyst for change. So we seek to engage and inspire and support private sector organisations to lead in the fight against modern slavery. And to do this, we have a business association of now 46 and counting member companies that we split out into 4 kind of broad working groups. So 4 kind of broad industries, although we're getting more and more diverse every day. If we go to the next slide, we can see we split these out into financial service providers. So we work very closely with banks and financial institutions to focus on the money laundering side of modern slavery and the kind of ethical investment side. We work with hospitality providers to combat modern slavery on premises within hotels, as well as within the supply chains of hospitality companies. And then we have 2 large kind of retailing and manufacturing type working groups that are very much focused on bringing greater transparency to their supply chains within those companies themselves, but also to those industries as a whole. Now, if we move to the next slide, you can see some examples of the member companies that we work with closely. And I've brought this up because the tool that we're going to show you today has been informed by the input of many of these organizations. And a number of these companies are actually implementing this within their supply chains kind of on a daily basis now. We regularly convene these organizations in working groups and in one-on-one conversations to understand what it is that is kind of what the barriers are, I guess, to them better identifying modern slavery within their operations, what better needs to be done within their industries to better strengthen those industries against labor exploitation. The companies will come to us, they'll put problems on the table, and then at the Mekong Club we work to address these problems while developing tools, technologies, resources, trainings, etc., etc. Ultimately, we're looking to really address the fundamental drivers of modern slavery. Now, we use the term modern slavery, it's essentially an umbrella term. It kind of applies to various different crimes. You may have heard terms like human trafficking, forced labor, bonded labor, indentured servitude. We use the term modern slavery to cover all of these different types of exploitation. It essentially refers to a situation whereby somebody is being forced to work against their will. Now, this can happen in many different ways. Oftentimes, debt is used as a means to keep people in employment. So you may have heard stories of workers going to look for a job in a factory or going to look for a job on a fishing boat or on a farm, having to pay significantly higher recruitment fees in order to secure that role. Now, this is exploitation in the first place, usually, but this gets even worse when those workers take on debt in order to pay those fees, and then they're not paid properly when they actually start work. So workers then fall into a cycle where they're having to essentially work for free. In the more extreme cases, you may have workers that are also being held in place due to threats to themselves or their families, due to violence, due to being physically constrained, or due to fraudulent employment contracts, due to deception, due to coercion. So there's many different ways in which people are being held in employment today. In the most extreme forms, this would be called modern slavery, but we anticipate that over 40 million people globally are in some form of kind of extreme labor exploitation right now. And approximately 16 million of those are within the supply chains of the clothes that we wear, the food that we eat, the electronics that we use every day. So this is a big issue, and it's impacting virtually every industry and every country in the world in some way. And it's highly profitable because when you exploit a person, you can exploit them again and again and again. It generates over 150 billion US every single year. And around 60% of that comes from Asia Pacific. A big part of the reason for that being a lot of our supply chains, so where companies that we're buying from source their materials, have their factories, are located here in Asia Pacific. So where there is demand, there is often, unfortunately, supply. Now, in order to combat this issue, companies carry out what we call social audits. So they will send people into factories within their supply chains to carry out various different checks. You know, they'll check paperwork, they'll check the working conditions, and also very, very crucially, they will often speak to workers in what we call a worker interview. So maybe they'll go into a factory, they'll pick 10 workers to speak to, and they'll ask them various different questions about their working conditions, how they were employed, what the recruitment process was, etc. Now, a couple of years ago, when we embarked on this project, we did a survey of over 200 social auditors and many of the companies that I showed you earlier to identify what the pain points were and what the barriers were to victim identification through this process, because we know there's millions of people in this modern slavery or labor exploitation situation, but we weren't identifying very many at all. And we identified a number of different barriers. The first of which is absolutely crucial, is communication, so language barriers. Oftentimes, the auditors going into the factory don't speak the language of the workers, especially when you have many different ethnicities within one factory, which is very often the case within supply chains. This meant that auditors was picking only those people that they spoke the language of to interview, which obviously skews results. We also found that workers were not, well, they didn't feel they were able to speak kind of candidly due to a lack of privacy. They may be being interviewed in a group with multiple other workers there, or even their management there. So you can imagine it would be quite challenging for them to raise a grievance when they don't know what the repercussions could be. We also found a lack of consistency in training between different auditors. So different auditors were asking different questions. And this meant that entire areas of labor exploitation were being left unaddressed. So labor exploitation isn't just you're not being paid properly, it may be you're being forced into doing excessive overtime, or maybe there's child labor issues. There's so many different facets to modern slavery, we found that they weren't all being consistently addressed. And then finally, trust. So workers didn't always necessarily trust the auditor that they were speaking to. And then companies may not necessarily trust the data that is being collected during the audit, again, due to this lack of standardization. So with that background, hopefully that makes sense in terms of understanding why we decided to embark on this project in the first place. And I'm now going to pass over to Sophie to talk about a prize audit. So this is a worker voice tool that was designed to use standard question lists in line with international labour standards to help auditors collect individual level data through their in-person audits. So it's been designed to help factories and companies understand how the working conditions are and how they're changing over time. So I'll hand over to Sophie now, who's going to talk about a prize audit and how it fits in also with the UN guiding principles. Thank you, Sophie.
Thanks so much, Phoebe, for the introduction to a prize audit. And yeah, I think it's important to kind of take a step back and zoom out about sort of what the UNU system is as a whole and how and why we fit into the building of a prize audit before we get into kind of the nitty-gritty of how the social compliance in-person auditing tool of a prize audit actually works. So to give a bit of background to everyone on the UN guiding principles, basically corporates have the responsibility to also respect human rights, but also the state has a duty to kind of enter in and protect human rights. So in the UNU system, we have a mandate to be working alongside member states to create policy relevant research and policy relevant projects. And engaging with these principles also allows us to see that states have to provide access to remedy. So this can be judicial or non-judicial depending on the circumstances, but these are kind of the values enshrined in the UN guiding principles that we try to bring to the product and to its project design. So our work has fit in as the migrant tech team at the United Nations University Institute in Macau across kind of three broad strands of output. The first being state-based labor inspections, where we've worked directly with member states, particularly with the government of Thailand, to implement a version of a prize audit called a prize with the Ministry of Labor there. We've also worked directly with civil society actors across the Asia Pacific on gathering worker feedback and supporting civil society outreach, basically to vulnerable workers directly. And a prize audit kind of is the third stream of our work in which we support with voluntary non-compliance monitoring with multinational corporations. So as Phoebe mentioned, we've been working with the Mekong Club since the founding of a prize audit, and we have worked with them to develop question lists, to build out membership. And so I'll get a little bit more into what the interface looks like before sort of giving you a background on why and how we've adapted a prize audit for COVID-19 when I'll pass over to Hannah. So here we have kind of the backbone and the back end of the software is that it's designed to identify the International Labor Organization, which is another kind of branch of a multinational and multilateral institution of forced labor. So you can see here that when you think of exploited labor, you might have a certain image in your mind. And in reality, there are a lot of different factors that can show kind of a spectrum of forced labor ranging from extreme exploitation on one end to decent work and on the other. So here you can kind of see the 11 indicators that we map questions onto, and we have two standardized question lists of between 32 and 42 approximately questions that a worker can respond to. And each of them will map onto, as you can see in the left column, an app category, one of these indicators to kind of give you a full picture of what's really going on inside the factory. So this will kind of give you an overview of the flow of a prize audit, and then give a bit of the background on the back end of how it actually works. So a prize audit in practice, as Phoebe mentioned, is an iOS and or Android app that an auditor, an in-person social compliance auditor, can download directly onto their phone. Once they have it downloaded, the auditor can at first select the question list that they choose. We have standardized question lists, as I mentioned before, because they're able to give a full picture, including those indicators. Secondly, an auditor will select a factory code from a list for their organization. So this allows a level of anonymity for each factory that ensures data privacy of the interviews collected therein. In the third step, using headphones, each worker is able to select their preferred language. So at this stage, the auditor takes from screen 2, plugs in headphones, and passes it over to the worker in screen 3. So that way, workers who have potentially, as Phoebe mentioned, literacy issues or do not speak the native language of the auditor are able to plug directly into the phone and take the survey in their native language. So once they've selected a flag that corresponds to the language, which will also say the name of the language in the audio, the worker is able to watch an introductory video after they give their consent to participate in the interview, and then answer a set of yes or no worded questions. So as you can see, the interface was designed to be as simple as possible and also allows workers to go back in a question list and modify. So say if they're nervous when they pick up the phone, they might be able to remember where their contract is, or they might actually be able to wanting to modify some of those questions. So they're able to do that. Then in the final screen, the auditor has the availability to kind of see as a whole some of the outcomes of the interview. And you can see on the right-hand side, there's a phone sort of icon, and that allows workers to basically contact the interviewees directly if the interviewees consented during the interview to provide their phone number, so that if there's some type of an urgent issue that the worker is facing, it will be very, very easy for an auditor to follow up directly if they consent. So this is kind of the flow of a prize audit, and I'm happy to answer more questions in the Q&A on this. So once all of these get sort of taken in interviews, we also have a backend interface, which is compatible here, and you can kind of see that you're able to set permissions for who in your company can see each individual interview or the aggregate of the interviews. So if you want the factory manager to be able to see, then you can set that permission yourself. It's very customizable, and we're happy to guide teams through it. So as you can see here, not only do we have the kind of factory code and date for each interview set, we also have it grouped by language, and again, a very easy filterable tab on the top. You can see the difference in interview names. So you see it says anonymous at the top versus auditor. And I'm actually going to pass over to my colleague Hannah to talk more about our COVID-19 compatible software, but that allows workers to take the survey themselves using their own phone, and that's why it's grouped sort of in the anonymous category. So again, you can toggle between which was done in an in-person audit and which was done using a prize audit remote, and Hannah will speak more about that. But what's great about this screen is you can really see what the indicators of forced labor were that were identified in the factory and how many. So that's there, and you can kind of get a full picture of what's really going on the ground. And that can go as detail oriented as you want. Keep in mind that multiple question lists might map onto the same indicator. So you can see that we've grouped sort of a danger response for each question as juxtaposed to a regular response. So again, happy to answer more questions about this in the Q&A, and this allows you to get a sort of full analysis picture of the data. So the results of this a prize audit project over the past 4 years that has been developed is that it's been implemented in 8 of the Mekong Club's partner multinational companies, including VF Corporation and Fung Group, which have been really sort of supportive of our work. Then thousands of factories across Asia Pacific region have used a prize audit as a part of their social auditing sort of tools or are currently using it. And we had several very successful case study examples. We're particularly proud of these 3. One being that a worker who'd worked for 20 years in a factory was actually interviewed for the first time using a prize audit. So that was an incredible experience to have their voice actually be heard through a worker voice tool. We've also been able to identify cases of forced pregnancy testing in factories where workers thought they needed a pregnancy test when in reality they didn't. And we've also identified, sort of been able to interview minority populations in their native language. So again, showing that this is a holistic software that can give you a full picture as a tool for your auditor of what's going on the ground. And then that data and that information is easily accessible for you as a company to kind of decide what steps you want to take next. So I'd like to now pass over to my colleague, Dr. Hannah Thinyane, who is the Principal Research Fellow at the United Nations University Institute in Macau and the founder of A Prize Audit, to speak a little bit more about our COVID-19 remote auditing adaptation. So Hannah, I'll pass it over to you. Thank you.
Cool. Thanks so much. So just before I get into the remote version, so a prize audit we have made specifically for supporting on-site inspections of workers. So an auditor goes to a factory, undertaking their normal kind of factory inspections. Part of the job is to talk to people. The reason they want to get this information is to triangulate some of the findings they've seen from other documents and things, which we'll talk about in maybe one more slide. But they want to get the information to make sure that the worker's voice is heard, and so that their voice can inform their next steps that they do in the inspections. So this has always been the case since I think we started in 2018, working in factories. So always specifically targeting on-site investigations, face-to-face, where there's a person in front of you. When COVID came along last year, the multinational corporations that we work with formed a working group around mid-2020. And they said, look, there's a problem now. They can't do their inspection. In some cases, there were movement restrictions, which meant that their auditors couldn't actually go out to talk to people. In other cases, what their problem was is they wanted to get different information. So the multinational corporations talked about two different options that they had themselves. First of all, they could just extend the current certification that they had for each factory, and that's what quite a lot of different corporations were doing. Or they could try and get some more information. And they asked, is it possible for us to support them to get more information, just to try and think of a way that we can get worker voice? Now, as an academic, my first thing was to say, we don't want to do anything remote, because we're giving people a chance to provide fake information, if I'm honest, because you never know who it is who is going to be answering questions when you're not there. At least when I'm standing in front of a person watching them fill out an interview, I can make sure that they're the one who answers the questions. There are other factors that go on in play, like coercion and all this stuff. But at least I can see that the right kind of person is the right kind of person answering. So we had to think if we wanted to do this, because it represented a big change in our focus. So going from the on-site to off-site and face-to-face to remote. We had in one of the early working groups, what actually kind of sold it to me was one of the brands actually said, you know, it's fine for you to say sitting in your nice comfy chair in your office, but what if this is the only a time that a worker has the potential of seeking help? So are we really going to be dismissive of their one opportunity to ask for help just because you think that someone else might use it for wrong purposes? And I think that put us in our place. And it actually made us think, okay, you know, this isn't going to be a solution forever. This is a solution for now, because at this time, multinational corporations, all these people know that labor conditions are changing rapidly, and they need some information, and they need to know what's going on in the ground. So if we go to the next slide. So I'm not sure how many people know what goes on in an audit. There are quite a few different stages. There is an initial data collection stage where you like onboard a factory. But when you actually do in-person audit, you start off with a site inspection. Often you look for who's going to be trying to exit while you're entering, because someone's trying to run away for a reason. You do some document review, looking at contracts, see if they have grievance processes, see what kind of grievances have been raised. You do interviews with management, you do interviews with workers, and all of these, the information from them come together to form a corrective action plan. So we started asking ourselves, which ones of these can easily be done online? And for us, because we had already started doing worker voice, it made sense to continue looking at worker voice, but for remote worker voice. So next slide. So we had a few different workshops with the stakeholders to try and understand what technology different people have access to, because there's no point in making a solution that demands high-end phones, for example, if everyone only has a TPG Nokia 3210, you know, it's not going to help at all. So we wanted to understand access to technology. We wanted to understand access to internet, because these are very big factors when you're looking at any kind of design for mobile devices. We ended up coming up with a system where we interface directly with the existing apprise audit, but to do so, we introduced this QR code. So a QR code is sent to a factory with a set of instructions, which are in the form of a cartoon with no words. And the factory is asked to post this QR code and cartoon somewhere where workers have access to it, where they are not surveilled, and where they also have access to their phones. And so a worker goes up to the QR code, they scan the QR code with their phone, and then you can see that same screen with the flags on it that Sophie described maybe 5-10 minutes ago now. And then they take part in our normal interviews. This helps with consistency of data collection because we have those same pre-recorded and pre-verified questions that have gone through many cycles of review to make sure that they are accurate and phrased in the right kind of way. What this does do from a technology perspective, it demands that people who are using the system have access to a mobile phone with internet connection and preferably with their own set of headphones. So as an academic, my background is in computer science and human-computer interaction. So our question is this feasible? Like, do factory workers have access to this technology and this internet? And would they want to use this kind of system to provide information about their working conditions? So can we go to the next slide? As preliminary results, our system's been used in countries around Asia, so Bangladesh, China, Malaysia, Myanmar, Thailand, and Vietnam. And what we've seen from the different brands that we work with is help them to gather information that they would otherwise not have access to. So one thing that's a bit different from the regular conditions of a prize audit is that the results are actually used to start a dialogue rather than specifically monitoring for non-compliance. So we had one of the brands talking about how workers in factories in Malaysia had been using the system to tell us that they were being forced to stay in their dormitories. In this case, we know that in Malaysia, there were movement control orders that had been issued by the state. And it was the factory that was just implementing the state movement control orders. And so the auditors got together with the factory and some of the representatives of the workers there to help them understand what's going on, what are the state-based orders, and what are any kind of imposition from them. Obviously, we were very worried at the beginning about access to digital technology. We saw that in some places. So in Bangladesh, we had some brands say that they don't have stable internet connection. And when you don't have a stable internet connection and you're trying to stream audio, it doesn't work. Maybe what happens is the video lags, the audio lags, sorry, and sometimes they end up having to re-download the same question or restream the same question. So yeah, this has really showed us that there are some access to technology issues that need to be overcome. But again, if we go back to the original point that the brands made for us about providing at least one way for people to ask for help, we really see benefit in this remote edition. One other critical factor I put there, freedom from coercion and response, has always been my biggest concern is how do we know who's answering questions? How do we know who's standing next to the person when they're answering questions? So how do we guarantee how accurate the information is that we're collecting? Again, I have had same discussions with the auditors about the same point, and they've said, how do you know who's coerced someone before you've even got to the factory? So it's that coercion that's always been a concern of mine, and it, I guess, continues to be a concern. But I think for us, this has shown an interesting little experiment. If I call the prize audit remote to the experiment of the system, we are very interested to see how it plays out in different countries, because again, it's about access to technology and it's about access to internet. They are these critical factors that really help or hinder people from reporting their working conditions. I think the next slide is our final one. Oh, no, I forgot about this one. So some of our findings that we've been really, after analysing the data, looking at for remote monitoring, we've been writing up, and our most recent one came out end of December or in December in the Delta 8.7 platform. If you're interested, I've put a URL down the bottom there where you can find a bit more about our thoughts about promises and limits of remote monitoring in addressing forced and child labour. This is a op-ed that we authored, the three of us, with someone called Leanne Melnick from Diginex, who's probably familiar to many people here as well. So with that, I think that's our final slides. If you want some more information about a prize and a prize audit, you can find more either on our Twitter handle or our website there. You can scan the QR code and you can get access. I think it just links right to his Twitter actually, and then you can find the links to all of our other stuff too. From here, I guess we can open up for some questions.
That's great. Thank you all. Yes, any questions from anybody? You're welcome to drop it in the text box, or just switch on your audio and ask it with either way. We'll also send around a follow-up with some of that information as well, so you can reach out and contact everybody.
Hi, I have a question. Can I?
Please go ahead.
Okay, this is working well, the audio suite. Hi, Sophie, Hannah. Yeah, Mekong Club, really interesting to listen about the, integrating workers' voices into the audit and audit process, and how just key that is. Yeah, my own background is in modern slavery risk analysis, and I was based in Cambodia. And I recall trying to verify information with union members and so forth in the textile industry, and hearing about their audit processes and how just the level of corruption and how information gets really twisted in the middle of that. So I think my question is sort of, and you mentioned this already, like do you have processes to screen or verify or encourage the workers who are answering the questionnaires? And I mean, in person, it's probably easier. I like your point on seeing who's fleeing and sort of making, sense of that. But how do you deal with that? How do you verify the information you're getting? I mean, that must be quite hard. And I suppose that's something that is an ongoing challenge for everyone. So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an ongoing challenge for everyone.
Yeah.
So a prize audit simply is a tool to support people to answer questions. The way we encourage people to answer is to provide a way to do it privately, even in front of other people. The other way we encourage them is to provide questions in their language. So other than that, we don't even collect personally identifiable information, because we thought that the risk of doing so far outweighs the benefit. So there's no way of doing like case management or anything like that in a prize audit. It's simply this gives us a screenshot or a screen capture of what happens in this factory right now. We know that people lie. So we also know that maybe the people are lying in the interview, but that is not the intention of a prize audit, to find out if people are lying or not. It's just to give them a chance to answer honestly in quite a stressful environment, if you're honest. If you think of how stressful these situations are for an audit, for the workers,
Yes.
They know often that it's going to, an audit is going to happen, and there'll be stress from the employers, make sure you answer correctly and all this. So we're trying to make the best conditions possible in these very uncontrolled environments.
If I may add to that as well, so we as a team don't have ownership of any of the data collected through a prize audit. So the way that we've implemented this project is by working in partnership with, at the moment, multinational companies that have their own internal audit, risk assessment, remediation, etc., teams and policies. So we would provide the tool to those companies, and they are then able to implement, and then they're able to conduct their own kind of internal processes when it comes to verifying and also reacting to the information that they're gathering. So we don't necessarily have to have an overview on the data collected unless the brands that we work with want us to, just to be clear.
Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you, Christina. Bessie, I think you have your
Yes.
virtual hand up there. I'll pass over to you.
Hi, Matthew. Hope all is well. To just move that point that you just brought up with respect to how we implement. First of all, thank you. That was a great presentation. And I don't know if you've already covered it, because we're trying to multitask between working at 10 a.m. and listening. So I just wanted to make sure to better understand how. So what is the business model in terms of if we wanted to engage the app, if we as a company wanted to use the app, we have third-party auditors that we send out. So that's already managed from a social compliance standpoint. Can you just elaborate a little bit on what options do we have to use your app, costs associated? And now I'm understanding that you don't own the data, so we either download it ourselves or use our third party. Can you just elaborate a little bit on what if I was to say, I'm interested? How does this kind of become part of our execution in our organization?
Sure, yeah, I can answer that. So in terms of cost, it does really vary depending on the size of the team. It doesn't really vary by number of countries or number of interviews. There's not really a limit on that. But say some of the organizations we work with have like over 100 auditors using this app every single month. So that it's more the training and the kind of support, technical support that would go along with scaling out to that size that would maybe there'd be a slightly higher cost. Some organizations also like to adapt the question lists, for example, to not that we recommend this because we've worked very hard on creating a question list that's been tested and tried and is standardized, but some organizations prefer to make adaptations to those question lists. Again, there's a bit of a cost there because you then need to adapt the translations and everything else that goes along with that. So there is some cost, but we're non-profit organizations, so it's definitely on the lower end compared to other kind of products that are out there in the market. In terms of engagement, we would encourage you to get in touch with us. We would give a demo so you can actually see the full suite of features on the platform. And then we encourage organizations to maybe pick 1 or 2 locations and carry out a kind of shorter trial. This allows them to test the question list. It allows them to understand how the app fits in with their standard audit processes. It allows them to understand the kind of potential of the app if they were then to scale it out. From there, we would then have another conversation about potentially rolling out on a larger scale. So it's fairly customized depending on the company needs, depending on the kind of countries you're going into, depending on the size of the team, et cetera, et cetera. But we're very open to this, yeah.
Yeah, it sounds to me like you're recommending to do it at the same time as the online audit. I mean, as the social audit, or while there are auditors physically in there. It sounds to me like you're kind of saying, don't try to do it remote, don't try to do it separately, but do it while you're doing your social compliance audit. Okay.
Yeah. And so generally speaking, at the moment, we're working with in-house audit teams within companies. However, we're very keen to engage with third-party audit providers as well. There's no kind of limit to that. If you're going in and doing an audit, we can provide that app. But that's, again, it's something that could be discussed on a one-on-one type basis to figure out the best way to incorporate this, again, as a tool to complement your existing processes rather than like an additional kind of project in itself.
Understood. Thank you very much.
Great question. Thank you, Bessie. Any other questions? If you do think of anything else for the first group, please do pop it into the question box. As I said, we'll push out some contact details and ways to follow up after this as well. Thank you very much to Phoebe, Sophie, and Hannah for that presentation. It's very, very insightful. What we're going to move on to now is just introducing our sort of second group to talk about this issue of modern day slavery, really from the labour supply end of this puzzle and the migrant worker issues, and then in particular the Hong Kong context of our domestic worker supply chain into Hong Kong. So I'm going to introduce some people that I know well. So Scott Stiles, who's the Executive Director of the Fair Employment Foundation, Victoria Arn, who's the Head of Marketing for the Foundation, and Grace Cheng, who is the General Manager of the Fair Employment Agency, which sits under the Foundation, working locally here in Hong Kong, where, just for transparency, I'm a director, hence my knowledge of the organisation. I sit on the board. So I'm going to pass over to you guys to do what you do, and over to you. Who's first?
Me.
Scott.
I'll go first. There we go. Thank you, Matt. Matt's been a huge support to us on the board level. Grace is nodding her head vehemently. He's been a difference maker for us in helping FAIR take the steps that we have over the last few years. And so thanks for putting this together and everything that you do for us. I wanted to just start off by kind of telling the FAIR story and talking a little bit about when we got started and why we got started and kind of what we've done thus far and what our approach has been. So we got started, I came on an internship in 2013, which seems like a really long time ago when I say it that way. Basically, I went on an internship to Hong Kong and saw the problems with domestic workers, right? And you'd hear about the cases of abuse and mistreatment, and it was kind of one of those things that I'd never heard of this type of problem before. And so specifically, I was doing an internship with my brother-in-law, who'd started a nonprofit in Hong Kong, and he kind of made me aware of these problems. And so when I was there, we talked about the idea of kind of disrupting the migrant recruitment industry. And so I went back to school. I went back to school after that summer, and I wrote up a business plan and sent it out to David Bishop. That's my brother-in-law, and he sent it to his network. And within just like would have been like a week, we got an email back from some folks at Goldman Sachs who said, "Hey, we're interested in funding you if you do this." And basically, our approach was that we wanted to address a lot of the forced labor and modern slavery issues that migrant workers face by going in. We saw that the recruitment agencies were creating huge problems because they were charging the workers these big fees, and they were also charging the employer. And so we said, well, and the reality is that people weren't satisfied with the services that they were providing either. And so we basically said, we're going to go and disrupt this industry. And so the business plan was basically to set up an ethical recruiter that would be operating and competing with kind of the shady industry that existed at the time. And so after graduating from school, I moved out to Hong Kong, and I showed up, and the folks at Goldman were like, "Whoa, you're serious about this, dude?" And I said, "Yes, I am dead serious. I have a pregnant wife at home, and I'll have very unimpressed in-laws if this doesn't work." And so we got going, and so they funded us. And that was just, at that time, it was, we had their two co-founders who are Tammy Baltz and David, who were both board members, and then one staff member in 2014 when we finally opened our doors. And since then, we have placed more than 5,000 workers into safe jobs in Hong Kong. And it's been super exciting as we've gotten to see the market change as well. Now, our approach is a little bit different. So our whole approach is that we want to create kind of system level impact, and we want to do it using the market forces. And so the theory of change for us is best, biggest, influence, impact. And so the idea is that we're going to be the best at what we do, right? If we were to open up a migrant domestic worker recruitment agency and just say, hey, what sets us apart is that we're really nice, there is some people who would use us, but there's a lot of people who wouldn't. And so instead, what we said is, we're going to be ethical, we're going to do the right thing, but we're going to be the best service provider that you're going to use for this industry. And so And we've become that. I think Grace should feel very strongly about that, but we've become that. And so basically we've executed on that. And the next thing is to become the biggest. And like I said, we're one of the biggest agencies in Hong Kong now. So it's an incredibly fragmented industry. There's 1,400 of these domestic helper, domestic worker recruitment agencies in Hong Kong. So just an astonishing number. And they're all kind of these little tiny operations. And the only reason why they can exist is because they're double charging the employer and the worker, right? So they're charging the worker this fee and they're charging the employer this other part of it. And so that number has kind of stayed solid. But what has happened since we got started in 2014 is that workers that are coming from the Philippines are paying about a third of what they were when we originally started. So across the industry in Hong Kong, the study that was done in 2013 by the Domestic Workers Alliance said that the average worker was paying about 2,000 US dollars. So it's about 15,000 Hong Kong dollars for a job. And the most recent study was done by a group called CFAR, and the average worker was paying just over 5,000 Hong Kong dollars, so about 700 US dollars. And so some of that, the market has changed dramatically in the way that we hoped it would. Now, I think there's been a bunch of different factors that have made that possible. I think that one of the big ones, I think that early on, I think we actually we helped kind of propel that change, because we came in and we showed transparently how much employers should pay for this recruitment, right? And when we started, a lot of these recruiters would show a very low price on their website. And then once you called them, they would basically see if you were willing to pay more, and they would just load the debt onto the worker if the employer wasn't willing to pay. Now, in the couple months after we got started, these agencies went through and changed their pricing, and the average price in 2016, the average price according to the Hong Kong government was our exact price, because a lot of these agencies had actually just followed our pricing structure exactly. And so that was a really cool kind of moment for us. And the really exciting thing that happened in that year was that workers went from the retention rate in Hong Kong, as employers paid a little bit more, went up 24% across
it's on the counter in the kitchen. You just dole it out yourself.
Oh, somebody's talking about kitchen counters and things. Just wanted to warn you, so you don't say anything that you don't want heard. So basically that was our approach, was that we were going to try to set this new model for the industry. And I'm happy to report that a lot of what we'd hoped would happen is happening, and that there's been really substantial progress. Workers from the Philippines, like I said, are paying about a third of what they were paying when we got started. The Indonesian government has recently announced their no agency fee policy for migrant domestic workers, and the Hong Kong government has actually acknowledged that and said that they are going to accept that. Now, there's always back and forth and some friction when these types of big changes happen, and so that's what they're kind of working through right now, but things are going in the right direction. And as we became bigger, we've found that there's opportunities where most of these government officials want opportunities to collaborate, want people to talk to that are going to be supportive, and we found opportunities to connect with them appropriately, right? And so that's been a really kind of exciting thing. And so as we've kind of taken those steps, we got the agency up and running, and then we saw that there was a huge problem with the training of migrant domestic workers, right? And so we spent a week basically where we went down to Manila to find the top-notch training center for these workers. And it was kind of the same story everywhere we went. We would go to the center and they would say, oh my gosh, this is the best training ever. And we'd say, okay, great. And we would walk in and there'd be this big empty room. It's like a 10 meter by 7 meter square room in kind of a generic old office building in Manila. And it would be an empty room, and we would walk in, and there would be 15 people kind of sitting in the corner of the room, and there's the one piece of furniture, which in 2 cases it was like a 1970s style wood panel TV set. It was awesome. And so we walk in, and the workers, they jump up and they have the French feather dusters, right, that have the feathers that are not wildly hygienic, probably not the things that we're using in many of our homes. And they'd go and dust off this piece of furniture and say, hello, sir, hello, ma'am. And then as we walk out, they all go back and sit in the corner and wait. And that was their training, right? Like they weren't doing the things that you do to actually prepare for migration. And so one of our co-founders at the foundation and I started kind of digging into this training issue, and she really took it by the horns. Her name is Jennifer Meehan, and she basically launched, working with a team in the Philippines, we've launched a training center there now, and that's called the Fair Training Center. And the focus of that is setting the standard for how this migrant recruitment training works, right? So we kind of view that as like an innovation hub where we're trying to develop the curriculum that we can then get out for other people to use. Now, in the Philippines context, that means that you have to have good relationships with the government. That means that you have to work collaboratively with the government because it's a highly regulated industry. And so that's what we've been kind of doing there. And that has been a really kind of exciting process as the Philippines government has opened up and come around in a lot of different ways. And so that's the training center. So we have the Fair Employment Agency, we have the Fair Training Center. And as the training center was getting stabilized and as the agency was getting stabilized and as Grace was stepping up and leading the team more and more, we started to look at the next stage of our journey. And so we've spent the last about 2.5 years working on setting up an agency in the Philippines. Now, COVID is putting some of that into question, and we'll see if what the next steps are for that. But as we've been working through those challenges on the Philippine side, it's funny, we've been kind of working through that. About a 1.5 years ago, I got a phone call from a lady who was in Malaysia, and she said, hey, I'm interested in working on this issue with migrant domestic workers. I'm interested I have this business plan. And she said, what do you think? And I said, well, the plan is close and you have the right problem, but I think that you should consider this agency approach because the agency has so much influence in this recruitment journey, right? We get to determine, we're working actively with the employer, helping determine, the type of working conditions. We're able to kind of create some realistic expectations on both sides. And I said, so why don't you consider this agency thing? And she said, let me think about it. And she called me back about 2 weeks later and said, yeah, I want to do the agency. Let's go. And I was like, okay, cool. And so I introduced her to a lady who'd interned with us about 1 year prior. And I didn't hear from them for 2 months. And then they called me up together on WhatsApp and said, hey, we both just quit our jobs. We're doing this. And so they actually launched an agency in Malaysia called Pink Collar. And basically that is an agency that's in the same kind of model and kind of in the same approach that we've taken at FAIR. And so as we've been, as we've hit challenges in setting up our own operations in the Philippines, there's been this new opening for us where we've realized where we're probably better suited is to actually, instead of trying to start our own businesses and start our own operations where you're going to run into corruption, you're going to run into a lot of the challenges of quite frankly, being an outsider in these industries. Instead, we can invest in those that are aligned with us in our vision and our approach. And then we can basically help, we're raising money right now to actually go invest in those businesses and help get them to where they can be to have the most impact. And so that's kind of the approach that we're taking going forward. And it's been really kind of an exciting journey for us because we've gotten to see from the very beginning of, we launched this first agency in Hong Kong, and, we saw the kind of the seeds of that at the beginning to, we did the training center in the Philippines, and that's the thing that the opportunities with the government there are very exciting. Looks like we've hit a roadblock here on the Philippines agency side, but as we were hitting a roadblock there, we saw this other opportunity for an investment approach. And so that's what we're kind of working on right now. And so at the foundation, our whole perspective is that this is very much a market problem. And so there needs to be some market solutions. And the audits and the things that are happening that Apprise is doing, or Apprise, I'm sorry if I didn't have the accent mark correctly, that's a critical piece of this because we need that information and that data so that we can then make the case for ethical recruitment and why this piece of the chain needs to be done better and done differently. And the neat thing has been from our perspective, even as we've gone out to try to find work orders and as we've tried to kind of on the Philippine side build that business, one of the coolest things for me to see has been how willing companies are to do the right thing, and how oftentimes you'll talk to people and they'll kind of say, oh, well, you're going to have to do it cheaper than the competition because these companies, they're evil corporations that don't care about people. And the reality is they're dead wrong. You know, from my experience, most of these companies have said, how can you deliver a service or a product that, or service, sorry, and you know, bring the talent in that can do these jobs in a way that we can feel good and we can be proud about, and at a cost that makes sense. And there hasn't been this kind of mass pushback that I think a lot of times the more skeptical parts of us believes is there. And so we're really excited about that. And as we kind of take the next steps at FAIR, right now, you know, we've done a lot of domestic work placements thus far, and that's been the focus. You know, we actually have dipped our toe in some of the non-domestic work, and especially hospitality in that industry as we were working on things in the Philippines. Now, as we go forward, we're really trying to diversify and get away from just domestic work. And we're looking at factories in Malaysia through pink collar and electronics and some of those other industries where we can have there's actually kind of better levers for us to grow how we want to there as well. And so that's kind of been the approach that that's kind of the story of FAIR thus far. And we're really excited because it's cool because, you know, 7 years ago when we started, I kind of thought like, this is, I hope this works, right? And the neat thing is that when I look through each year, even as we've run into challenges and as we've hit kind of roadblocks along the way, this approach of attacking the agency side and really, you know, setting a new standard, I'm more and more convinced that this is an approach that can change millions of people's lives. And I'm pretty convinced of it. And so that kind of concludes my thoughts for the discussion today. And I'll have, if there's Q&A, we'll do that afterwards, right, Matt?
Yeah, I think so. Let's do the Q&A at the end, and we'll go from there. Who's going to go next?
It's me. So thanks,
Okay.
Scott.
Over to you,
Yeah.
Grace.
And thank you, Matt, again, you know, for inviting us to this webinar. So I'm Grace, and, you know, from the Fair Employment Agency, and I'm going to share with you a bit about my journey, you know, with FEA. So I joined FEA close to 6 years ago, and it's actually going to be my anniversary next month. It's crazy, you know, how much has changed over the years in our organization and also in the broader market. And I'm just really glad that I got to witness the growth of FEA over the years, from a small team of like 4 people to over 20 staff in 2 offices now. So like this job at FEA is my second job out of college. And like Scott, I knew very little about this forced labor problem. My own family never had hired any domestic workers. And the only domestic worker I knew at the time was my cousin's worker. She has been working for the family for over 20 years. And I kind of took it for granted. That's just the norm for hiring domestic workers. And I remember when I was preparing for the job interview and read through Fair Agency's website. And that's when I learned about how corrupt this industry has been and how many unethical agencies took advantage of these vulnerable women and exploit them for profits. And after knowing more about the problem, I remember thinking to myself, this no-fee model that FEA proposed just seems so simple, but it makes so much sense. When agencies don't charge workers fees and the interest is aligned with the employers to make a good match, then there would be less turnover rate and no more debt bondage. But of course, little did I know what I got myself into when I accepted the job offer. I was 21 when I joined FEA, you know, typical fresh graduate full of ideals, but not a whole lot of understanding about how the world works. I mean, there are challenges to every job, and it makes sense that we all kind of think our job is the hardest and it shouldn't be a competition. But like if it were a competition, I'm fairly confident that our business should be, you know, kind of on top of the list. I mean, imagine like if you were an employer, basically you need to trust a stranger from another country with language barriers, with cultural differences, to live in your home 24/7 and to take care of your newborn babies or elderly parents. And if you were a domestic worker, you're leaving your own family. And many times it's their first time to leave, you know, the country, and they're under so much pressure to pay back this huge debt to cover the agency fees from the beginning. And oftentimes they barely know anything about the employer they're going to work with. I've heard, from so many workers telling me that the agencies just ask them to sign a blank contract when they arrive. And then when they arrive to Hong Kong, their household is, completely different from what they were told by the agency in the Philippines. And if you were me, like as a recruitment consultant, making the match between the employer and worker, you have to develop this understanding of human psychology, navigate through so much fears and insecurities of the employers and workers, and make a recommendation that would affect the lives of these two people in the next 2 years. And this is just the beginning. After the match is made, we also need to become experts in immigration policies, coordinate with two governments in the sending and receiving countries to process the visa application. And then throughout the whole 2-year contract, we also need to play the role of mediator and social worker to support both the employers and workers with any issues. Who to kind of call, like if the worker has performance issues or, got pregnant or got sick. And spoiler alert, it's not the Ghostbuster, but the employment agency, right? So, with so many challenges and hurdles, that's why it's very fulfilling to see the matches turn out to be successful and long-lasting. And that's how, agencies are able to, really impact the lives of both employers and employers. So in our office, of course, we celebrate when we make a placement, but we are really the happiest when we hear that workers and employers are renewing their contracts, even if it means we, lose a business opportunity. But when the match doesn't work out, it could also feel very personal. I remember the first time a worker I placed got terminated after a few months. I was the one crying when I found out about it, and the worker had to be the one to comfort me and to tell me that these things inevitably happen. So now 6 years into the business, instead of crying over terminations, we're trying different ways to hopefully reduce the termination rate as much as possible. So unlike other unethical agencies out there, which actually benefit from a high turnover rate, they want the employers to terminate their workers as soon as possible so that they can charge another worker as replacement. But then for us, we actually want the match to succeed because we need to operate on merit. So for years, we didn't have the budget to do any marketing, and basically all of our clients came from word of mouth. And then internally, we have this screening process in place to vet out employers who are not ready to manage and workers who are not ready to work. And then instead of just showing a resume or a pre-recorded video, we always ask our workers and employers to meet face-to-face, and ideally in the employer's home, so that the worker can see the working environment. Of course, doing face-to-face interview is not as possible during COVID times, but we still ask them to do a video call to show the pictures of the house. And then for workers coming to Hong Kong for the first time, we always recommend them to join the Fair Training Center to better prepare them for migration. And then after the placement is made, we have follow-up surveys and calls with employers and workers to understand how they are doing and to provide support as needed. In Victoria later, we'll share more how we've been trying to do more broad employer education as well about hiring and manage through the Fair Hiring Pledge. It's still a work in progress, but we have already seen, how the market actually responds very well to our model. When we first started, many workers were very doubtful that we really don't charge them any fees. And they would still ask me, so how much do I need to pay you, ma'am, after, we match them with the employer. But now that, we're quite well known within the community, we have grown our Facebook follower, close to 100,000 when there are like 200,000 Filipino workers in Hong Kong. And we also find out that employers are very receptive to suggestions and very willing, to change. Oftentimes, they don't intend to make life difficult for the worker on purpose. They just simply don't know or don't have the awareness. And we have heard a lot, from the workers that they're leaving their jobs because they don't have enough food. And when we ask the employers, do you know if your worker have enough food to eat? They are just oblivious, right? But once they realize it's something that they should check in with their workers, they have no problem doing it. And then since 2018, we're already, the top 10 Filipino agencies in Hong Kong, among 1,400 agencies. And just 2 years ago, we also got our accreditation with the Indonesian consulate. And last year, we opened our first branch office in the new territories, where more local families and Indonesian workers live, hoping that we could serve a wider population. At FEA, we believe forced labor is a solvable problem, but doesn't mean it's an easy one. We're overcoming all these hurdles one by one to get there, and we could really use all the help we can get. So I will now pass the time to Victoria to share more, how you can be involved. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Grace, and thanks, Connected Group and everyone on the call. I'm Victoria, and so yeah, I'm gonna talk a little bit about how making employers part of the solution is such an important part of all of this work. So if you talk to any of us on our team, something we really, really believe is that most people are good, but most people are bad managers, except you, Scott, and other managers on this call. But most people are good, and most employers want to do the right thing, but management is hard, and especially like Grace was saying, managing a domestic worker is very different. Workers coming from a very different situation, coming into a Hong Kong home, which has many different appliances that are new and a lifestyle that they're not used to, like cultural gaps, professional gaps to overcome. So this is a huge gap, and unfortunately, there is very little guidance on this topic. The information that's available is, from the Labor Department or Immigration Department, which could be very overwhelming and very legal based, or it's what you hear from others. And unfortunately, there's a lot of misinformation and myths out there spread by agencies over the years. Obviously, there are agencies that are incentivized to create failure, because once a worker is terminated, they can just charge a new worker and make a profit that way. So, and we really shouldn't underestimate the impact that employers can have on this issue. Imagine if employers went into agencies aware of all these things, and they were ready to ask their agent, so what does this fee cover? Is it going to cover everything that's necessary? Are you going to charge my worker? Imagine if the employer asked their worker, did you get charged anything? That's going to scare agencies that are acting badly, and that's going to change everything so fast. Employers are not going to be satisfied with just seeing bio data, height, weight, photos of domestic workers, if they know about what they should be looking for when they're hiring someone and knowing what it takes to manage a worker in their home. And this is what we want to see. Actually, when I first joined FAIR, I had been working at a charity in Hong Kong, providing financial education to domestic workers. And I would see over and over again workers who've been working in Hong Kong for 20 plus years, still in debt and worried about going home, because if they were to go home, they would be penniless, no savings. And, either their daughter or someone else in their family would have to become a migrant worker in their place. So when I heard of FAIR and how we can change things from the root, change how workers arrive in Hong Kong, prevent them from spiraling into debt from the beginning, I was really excited. And employers are a key part of the solution, right? So changing how we talk about hiring migrant workers is possible, but it really needs to be done in a way that gains the support of all sides. At FAIR, we focus on engaging employers positively. It's actually a very personal hire, someone who you need to know about their lifestyle, their home, their family, and helping employers understand that ethical recruitment works in their favor is key. When employers are aware, they will set better expectations and create successful employment situations. And that's when they will drive demand for ethical options. So this is kind of the thinking behind our fair hiring pledge. So let me just share the screen quickly. Chrome tab. Yes, so the Fair Hiring Pledge. This is an initiative that we have at FAIR. Companies are increasingly interested in using their position of influence for good, and we saw an opportunity to help create win-win situations for companies and their own staff by, providing something that companies can offer to their own employees to help them juggle home life and manage domestic workers fairly. You'll see on the screen our 21 signatories. They are, and it's amazing to see all those names there. And I think it's because these companies see how the pledge is a valuable way to support staff with their home lives. So as part of the commitment to the Fair Hiring Pledge, what companies do is that they're making a statement committing to be a positive influence and leading change agent in Hong Kong by supporting conscious and ethical hiring practices of migrant workers. And they also set a message to their own employees that they expect them to be ethical employers. And a second part of their commitment is that they host us to come in and run an hour lunch and learn session about these topics, like what you should be thinking about when it comes to hiring, what you should be thinking about when you're managing. And these are very friendly, lunchtime sessions that really make it easy for people to get practical guidance and ask questions. We once had a lady who came to our lunch and learn session, and she came to us and at the end and told us that she had terminated over 10 domestic workers. And not until then has she understood why, and maybe that she was part of, the management might have been part of this situation. That's what happened. And what happened was that summer she made her son volunteer with us for 3 months for free, which was really great. So domestic worker management is uniquely personal, and we need people and want people to ask questions. And for them to do that, we need to engage them positively. And that's why we've seen such success with the pledge sessions. Apart from the pledge sessions, we also have put a lot of effort into getting information out there by our website portal called Get Answers. And we have maybe 70 plus articles there now on different topics to do with hiring, management, where can I get further training, how do I set a schedule for a domestic worker kind of thing. And it follows the same approach to help employers get balanced and practical and relatable information out there. And with COVID, there has been really rapid changes over these months. So we've been updating the site every other day just so that people are getting the right information and they're not being taken advantage of. Feel free to screenshot this slide for your future reference. And so what can you do? So one clear way that you and your company can be part of the solution to make domestic worker hiring better for everyone, is to become a fair hiring pledge signatory, this is really quite simple. Actually, I mentioned the 2 commitments that companies have, but also it's free of charge and also not legally binding because we wanted to make it as accessible and simple for companies to consider. So yeah, and that is, and I hope if you have any questions about the Fair Hiring Pledge, please feel free to reach out. My email is right there. Another easy few things that you can do is subscribe to our newsletter, which has the latest relevant information for domestic workers and employers, or remember that we are a charity. Yeah, great. Thank you so much, everyone.
That's great. Thank you, Scott, Grace, and Victoria. Very, very useful insights. I just want to kind of add to that before I open it up to see if there are any questions. That from a commercial perspective, if you just ignore the fact that there's a social impact of what fair employment are trying to do, as an employer, I think what gets lost sometimes is that domestic workers really are part of the commercial fabric of Hong Kong. They enable parents and women in particular who are sort of unduly burdened post sort of having children to be able to return to the workforce more quickly and easily. If you are relocating people from overseas into your organization, then hiring domestic help to support with childcare, etc., makes a big difference to the efficiency and sort of the integration of those workers as well. But equally, a poorly managed process and a misunderstood process can have a negative impact on the efficiency and the impact of your employees. So I think that you can look at this on 2 fronts, right? One which is there's a positive commercial impact to engaging on this issue, as well as a social impact as well. Does anybody have any questions for the guys at FAIR? I've got a question that's been sent in that Steph is put in here. Do you find that a lot of employers of domestic workers are aware of the agency fee issue? So when you guys engage with potential employers, how much awareness do you see? I'm sure that's sort of changed over time, but Grace, maybe you can answer that one.
Sure. Yeah, it did. Like, I do think that, over the years, we see more and more employers who, aware that workers are paying these huge fees, and that's how they got into this, loan issue, right? So I think for a lot of employers, this is not something they want to see either, because like those loan sharks would, when they don't get payment, how they're going to kind of threaten the workers by calling them, incessantly, or even go to, the home of the employer, which is where they work, to try to get money out of them. So, how we have always trying to explain to employers that, of course, you're making an ethical decision by using us and not, putting your worker into that bondage. But then, for your, own family, safety and your, peace of mind, it's also, very helpful, when you know that the person you're hiring who's going to live with your family is not going to be burdened by this huge loan. So yeah, I do think, over the years we see more and more employers become aware of this, and we also make it a, an important point, like when employers come to us, and we always make sure we understand this problem to them, even if they just come to us initially because they heard that we are a good agency, that we're helpful, but we still try to, through these calls and interactions, try to, do some, education here and there.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I spent 15 years in Hong Kong until I engaged with FEA. Did I truly understand the nature of that issue and the impact of that issue as well? Any questions?
I have a quick one. I really love the model, Scott and team, Victoria and Grace, and wondering, just had a thought. How are other agencies in Hong Kong responding to this, market disruption? And are you seeing, are you able to perhaps even educate the other agencies as well on this issue and kind of change the overall market in that sense?
Yeah, so that's the fun question. So I mean, I'd say as a whole, we've tried really, really, really hard to not be viewed as attacking them, right? And we've tried to kind of keep our own kind of steer clear of any insinuation or the idea that we would be aggressively kind of confrontational. And so that has been helpful. Now, as things started to change, one of the kind of a cool story on that note. So when we first got started, so this is in 2014 that we did our launch, or 2015. Was it 2000? Yeah, 2015 we did our launch event. January. In March, we get this letter from the consulate saying, hey, you've been accused of breaking all these rules, right? And it was basically saying that we were, sending workers to Macau to avoid some of the processing costs and things like that. And the funny thing was, it was super easy to prove we weren't doing it, because like, here's our flight tickets, like, here's our receipts, like, we're not doing that. Now, and at that moment, I kind of had this thought where I was like, oh, like, this is a good sign. Like, they actually see this change as is coming, right? So we got that letter. Now, about 2 years later, I was at an event that was it was an ILO event that was International Labor Organization that was hosted by a company. And I ended up sitting next to the guy who had actually signed that letter accusing us of breaking the rules, right? So I'm sitting, he's like the head of an agencies association. And so, and I have, my whole perspective is like, I don't think most of these people are like, they're not like sitting in cigar-filled rooms trying to rip off these workers, right? The reality is that I don't agree with their business approach. I don't agree with some of their ethics, but that could be said for lots of different situations, right? And so, and they're small business people that are kind of justifying the way that they operate because that's how they've operated for a long time. And so we were just having a nice, pleasant conversation. And then finally, I kind of looked over at him and I said, hey, what's the, you weren't real excited when we got started, were you? And he kind of looks at me and you can see him kind of smirk because he'd been expecting this conversation to happen at some point, right? And he goes, yeah. And I said, so what do you think now? And he's like, actually, you have been the best thing that happened to our industry, because we all had our prices artificially low and the nonprofit can't have the lowest prices. So we have all followed your pricing model, right? And so it was one of those cool things where we were actually able to get from the agencies association head, because you don't know if there's a causation or a correlation when it comes to a price change or different market things that could happen. We got a pretty good, clear, evidence that it was causation. We caused the change in the market price. And he said, so you guys actually initiated that and we've just followed your pricing. And so, over the years, there's been kind of more advocacy work that's been done by various groups that they are not happy about, and they kind of point at us. But that's part of the nature of it, right? The key for us is that we just don't want to be viewed as kind of antagonizing them, and we don't do it unnecessarily, and we try to really stay clear of it. But there will always be some pushback, and we need to be very careful in how we tread and when we share our story and who we share our story with, so that we don't kind of step on more people's toes.
Okay, thanks, Christina.
Does that answer your question?
Any other questions? So I think we've got a mixture of people here. I just encourage the individuals thinking of themselves as the direct employer of a domestic worker to make sure they are fully aware of these issues and that they hire ethically, and of course encourage them to use Fair Employment Agency. Those of you as employees of corporates, or if you have any influence from a HR or communications perspective, talk to your organizations about integrating this conversation to help your employees understand how to be both ethical in the way that they approach the hiring of domestic workers, but also to get more out of that process and to develop more stability and sort of comfort at home with your domestic worker hiring, because ultimately that's good for your organizations as well. So if there are no other questions, I think we've had a really good session today. Two great parties. Thank you both to both sets of speakers. We've recorded this, so we will share it with you afterwards. We'll share the contact details of all the speakers. And if you have any questions, you're welcome to reach out to them, reach out to me, and wish you all a good weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.